Nancy, I want to thank the Peace Alliance for inviting me to come and spend some time with your wonderful organization. I must say that the idea for a Department of Peace is long overdue. It's something that the country should have had many generations ago, and I'm really glad now that there is a incipient movement and people are actually doing work to make that happen because even if it doesn't happen anytime soon, that's a phrase we organizers use quite a bit, right? Even if it doesn't happen anytime soon, it's going to raise awareness, it's going to educate people, it's going to get people in this country and other countries thinking about, and this is where storytelling comes in, I think, because it really wasn't until I left the US that I began to understand and I began to hear stories from people outside of the country, especially in Central America, and the stories about my country, about the United States, the country I grew up in, from people in Central America in the mid 1980s when I was there in US Special Forces, were such radically different stories that I grew up and had been accustomed to in certain ways. But this idea of a peace department will allow us to tell different types of stories about who we are as Americans. And that is so, so very important. My wife, Sheila, and I, who were both longtime and very proud members of Veterans for Peace, we're members of Veterans for Peace in Gainesville, Florida, Chapter 14, led by the legendary Scott Camille and Sherry Steiner. But recently, Sheila and I, my wife and I, were actually in Greece and Amsterdam and Egypt, and we spent most of the time of that trip in Egypt. And the stories that we heard from people, and we arrived in Egypt around, I think, the end of the first week of November. And it was really incredible. The people were just loving, they're welcoming. They were very embarrassed in a certain sense because, and they would say things that I've heard during my international travels as long as I've been traveling internationally. And the people would take us aside and they would say, we love Americans. We wish more Americans would come to Egypt to learn about our history, our cultures, because in Egypt is a very cosmopolitan nation. It's very multicultural. It's very multilingual. If you speak French, you have an automatic advantage. Obviously, if you speak Arabic, that's really cool. But the children in school, from the youngest age in schools, are taught English as a primary language to learn. And they see English, again, thinking of storytelling, as an international language. It's very different when we come back to the US and people talk about, English first, English should be America's only language. It's very different when you travel overseas. But the thing I wanted to share with you was that in Egypt, people would say, look, we know that Americans love peace and we love you for it. We know that at deep down in your heart of hearts, you embrace nonviolence. They know about icons. In fact, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is the greatest icon in North Africa, in the Middle East, in terms of from the United States. But they would also say, please tell Joe Biden, no more war. Egypt is just tired of the wars. We tried that pathway. We fought with Israel. We had different wars, but we've realized that you can't have it all. You cannot have. And in Egypt, since the revolutions, they've been trying to build affordable housing. They've been trying to build a national healthcare system. They've been trying to build a national collective bargaining system. And what people told us over and over again was, you can't have it. You can't have everything. You can't have it both ways. You can't have a vibrant civil society. And there are still problems in Egypt. There's a lot of authoritarianism. It's not a perfect country. But what we saw of it, we loved. And we loved the idea that people know that you can choose affordable housing or you can choose war, but you can't have both, right? There's only so many resources that you have that a nation has to work with. So those were stories that we heard quite a bit in Egypt. We were embraced everywhere. We had just arrived when Egypt when Israel and the US and the UK were pressing Egypt to accept over 100,000 refugees from Gaza. And I want us to think about what that means for a country like the US or the UK, especially with our recent histories, and not just recent histories, our shameful history during World War II. Let's be clear, where we could and should have accepted tens of thousands of Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany, from Nazi occupied Europe, and by and large, we closed our doors, we closed our gates, and many died. And Ken Burns had the magnificent series on the Holocaust, which I highly suggest everyone watch, because that series connects racism and anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant politics seamlessly together. And that's kind of where we are as a country right now. But getting back to Egypt, the idea that a nation of that size and dealing with trying to overcome generations of colonialism and poverty, the idea that they could accept 100,000 refugees is just insane. And we arrived in Egypt at the same time that the US put Egypt on the terrorism watch list again. And so there were no Americans there. And everywhere we went, everywhere Sheila and I went, we were like celebrities. And people knew we were Americans. They came up to us, they shook our hands, they offered to buy us dinner. It was really an amazing thing. When I think about my own youth growing up in the United States, I couldn't imagine as a kid being where I am today, speaking with you today, speaking with the Peace Alliance. We didn't know anything about peace when I was growing up. I grew up in a military town, Bremerton, Washington, a shipyard town. I'm a third generation US military combat veteran. My family's combat history goes back, I mean, centuries. That's not an exaggeration. And that's ironically the one thing, and that's the one kind of historical thread of my family that we can connect back through the generations is a war, a revolution, an uprising. Whether it was an insurgency against the French during the American Civil War, the Mexican Revolution, which my grandparents, male and female, all fought in. But once we fled to the United States, our family in 1914, my great grandparents' generation and grandparents' generation, immediately conscripted to fight in World War I, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. I still have family members who are deployed overseas, everywhere you can just about imagine. And many of my family members live in the Philippines, they live overseas, or places where they actually were stationed during active military duty. But growing up in Bremerton, we didn't know anything about peace, y'all. We didn't know anything about nonviolence. No, the phrase nonviolence was a stunning phrase to me. I didn't encounter it until years, I think after I left. Well, I can tell you exactly when I encountered it, but we didn't even know there was an anti-war movement. And what I mean by this was that I was born in 1964, towards the tail end of the Vietnam War era, as I was in kindergarten and first, second, third grade. And if there had been an anti-war movement in my town, I didn't know about it, and I still don't know about it. I mean, if there had been an anti-war movement in Bremerton, Washington, where every single person literally is in the military, active duty, veteran, retired, civil service. Currently, my sister is a GS-14 in the U.S. Civil Service, and she does billets for the U.S. Navy all over the world. She has a very rarefied kind of job. But I grew up in the kind of environment where war was all we knew. Stories about World War II, stories about World War I, again, Korea, Vietnam, trauma that it would take hours to walk you through. Many of the men I grew up, and as a kid, I didn't know this was happening, but I knew something was wrong. Many of the men who returned from Vietnam, Korea, even World War II that we grew up around, they were severely traumatized by their experiences. And it wasn't until my senior year in high school that I began to get an inkling of what this meant, because I picked up a book that had been banned. It was nowhere to be found in my hometown. It was nowhere in our public library. It was not in the school library. We were told we were not to read it. We had a high school English teacher, Don Bidwell. He was a U.S. naval veteran. He said, by God, if the rich kids in the prep school next county over can read this book, you can read the book. And that book was Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse Five.
Yeah.
And to me, that is the most precious book that I think I've ever read, because it's very much explains the society I grew up in, where men and women had been severely traumatized by war. And so much so that things like time travel, some people think about Slaughterhouse Five as a science fiction story. But that's the kind of displacement that you feel. I mean, when I go home today to Bremerton, many of the people, the comrades that I knew that were in military service concurrent with mine, it's very hard for us to even have a reunion, because so many of us either died early, maybe not from combat, but maybe from radiation, maybe from asbestos, Agent Orange poisoning. And so we had a party, for example, my sister and her husband, who retired Navy, he had two deployments, combat deployments in Iraq. And we tried to have a party with some military, veteran folks, and it was very difficult. One of them, a young man who I known for years, was not able to come into my sister and her husband's house because he was terrified of being in enclosed spaces. He had to stay in his car. He was parked about a quarter of a mile away. He had a very hard time talking to people without physically reacting in a very kind of traumatized way. My sister asked me to bring a piece of cake out to him. I talked to the young man about his experiences in Iraq, and it was just terrible. I mean, to think that our country still puts young people through the trauma of war and still supports war, to me, is the most heartbreaking thing that I can share with you today, because we should know better. Everyone should be a member of the Peace Alliance, because if you understand what war does to military veterans, to civilians, Nancy started us off by alluding to what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Gaza. Um, I know growing up that a war never ends until the last civilian and the last veteran of that conflict pass away. And even there, they pass down traumas. My father, my grandfather passed down traumas to us. My father, by the way, was recruited to take part in the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. He had a very rarefied set of communication skills, some of which he passed down to me. He didn't go, hence here I am. But there are other traumas, such as my great uncle Jesse, who fought in a rifle platoon during the invasion of Okinawa in the Pacific Campaign during World War II. His squad was caught too far forward in the advance on the Japanese Imperial Army positions, and led by a very inexperienced young second lieutenant. They were hit by what we call inflated fire. That is, they were surrounded by the enemy. And over a period of 2 to 3 nights, his entire squad was killed, except for great uncle Jesse. And when he came home, he was my father. He had been my father's favorite uncle.
Mm-hmm.
Great uncle Jesse had worn a zoot suit, right? Does anyone remember what a zoot suit or heard about a zoot suit? It was long, very colorful. And I apologize if I have to use a sexist term. He was known in the 50s or in the 40s as a ladies' man. He was very charismatic, very outgoing, and my father's favorite uncle. But my father said when Uncle Jesse came back from the war, he was just a shell, literally a shell. And he was haunted. He would have visions during the broad daylight, and he would shout out, "Why me? Why me?" And my father didn't know at the time what that meant, but in retrospect, he believed that the "why me" was, why did I survive? Why did I lose all my comrades and friends, and why did I survive? And sometime in the summer of 1948, my father went to go check on his uncle Jesse, and he found him dead in an empty house surrounded by no furniture, just photographs of his comrades in the U.S. Marines, most of whom my father assumed had died. And so those are the types of stories that I grew up around. And it was I have to tell you, it was very disempowering on the one hand, very kind of terrifying. I knew I would end up going to the military. There was no question. It wasn't even a question of patriotism. It was a question of, Your father did it. Everyone you know in your neighborhood did it. Now it's your turn. Kind of, next man up, as we say in sport and in football. And so I did, tour duty with 82nd Airborne and with 7th Special Forces in Central America. And again, the stories that I heard as a young soldier in Central America from people from the region, from Honduras, from Colombia, from El Salvador, from Nicaragua, from Honduras, and I did a lot of. Most of my work was I was on my own, and I was what they call a fixer, and my job was to help units. If I wasn't helping train people from the region, I was helping units get back in units that had lost communication um, with U.S. Southern Command, which at that time was based in what we call the Panama Canal Zone, which is obviously Panama, the country now. So we did a lot of what was called terrassing, which again, I apologize for the phrase. That was the military. That's the phrase we used. But then again, I learned from people. I mean, I saw my first political protest, by the way. The first political protest I ever saw took place near the School of the Americas, which at that time was at Fort Gulick, Panama Canal Zone. And young university students from the university in Panama came and laid down in front of the highway in front of the military base. They were beaten by the Civil Guard from the Panamanian Civil Guard, and the U.S. troops were in support of them, just like we're in support now of the Israeli Defense Forces. That's kind of what we do. But these students would come every week, and they would come and they would lay down on the highway. They would get beaten, they get arrested, and they would come back. And when I was in country, by the way, which is the phrase we used, in country meant Indian country. And special forces, when you say that you're in country, that's Indian country. And that is a holdover survival of the era of settler colonialism. But I remember asking an older Black gentleman who shined shoes in front of the School of the Americas, and I assumed that he was a grandson of the original Panama Canal builders. I asked this elderly Black man, I said, well, you know what? It's so weird to me. Every year, every week, these students come back and get beaten up, arrested, and they come right back. Who on earth would do that? They must be crazy, man. And this gentleman kind of looks at me and in a very, very traditional Panamanian, Central American kind of cultural posture, patiently explains to me what I'm not seeing. Okay. And so he said, well, young man, let me try to explain this to you as best as I can. Imagine that you had someone who you didn't know come into your neighborhood. I don't know where you live, but imagine that you have someone or a group of people come into your neighborhood, put guns in the hands of your teenage boys, teach them how to shoot each other, and then just leave. What would you do? And I said, wow, we would sort that out pretty quickly. And we wouldn't allow those people to leave, number one. And he said, well, there you go. That's why these students are protesting, because this is what you Americans do wherever you go. And I didn't know, I couldn't process this at the time, but as I got older, it began to make sense because I grew up in a gun culture. I grew up where there's so much violence that, I mean, the stories to me, I mean, I remember the first time I was shot at, I was in 5th grade. I can still remember the rush of the projectiles as it kind of brushed in front of my right knee and embedded into a wall that was next to me. And at the time, was it shocking? Yeah. Was it terrifying? Yeah. I was in 5th grade. But was it unusual? No, I didn't really think that was unusual to be shot at in the 5th grade, because where I grew up, that was just the stuff that happened all the time. To me, the transition is in organizing. To me, the first time in my life that I felt that I could transition away from having to constantly defend myself or learn how to shoot or whatever was when I learned the power of collective organizing. And I
Mhm.
suspect this is similar for so many people. I'm writing a book now called A Social Movement History of the United States, but it was really through that kind of self activity and gaining confidence. And mine came primarily initially through the labor movement and working with the United Farm Worker Union and actually standing up and fighting and defeating a couple big corporations. One of them was US Tobacco. Oh my gosh, during the Chateau Saint Michel wine boycott, that was an incredible victory, which gave me faith that
Mhm.
nonviolence was much more effective than violence. And the last thing I'll mention is Veterans for Peace, which grew out of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War movement, and to be around other people who kind of went through similar trajectories that I did and now bear witness for nonviolence and peace is really an amazing thing. But I think, Nancy, the key is doing it in groups, organizing collectivities,
Mhm.
giving ourselves a break. No one can do it individually. The system wants you to think of yourself as an individual, and that's great, but you can't. If you want to change the system, you can't do it really as an individual. It has to be a group organizing process. So that's how I made my transition. I think that the U.S. and Joe Biden and others are trying to press the Israelis to reduce civilian casualties, but I say we, I'll just say because they're, as you know, they're acting on our interests as citizens. They're failing completely and utterly. I, you know, being in combat and growing up with that environment and knowing a lot of military history, um, it either one has to somehow suspend judgment and believe that either the U.S. either the Israeli Defense Forces are utterly incompetent and failed to achieve operational control for weeks and weeks and weeks, um, or they just don't know how to aim bombs correctly. I mean, because the level of civilian casualties is really stunning. It's really unprecedented in that kind of environment. And the way that the US media is talking about this, it's almost as if they're talking about Gaza as if it was like World War II again, because they're talking about, tonnage and things like that. And you know much more about that as an Air Force officer. But I think that, yeah, I think that the United States and I think that other nations, France stands out as well, are saying, to the IDF, look, you got to get yourself under control. But I'm not sure the IDF is in control of their own actions at this point. I think that the Israeli government right now, if you look at the leadership, it's mediocre, and that's as best as I can do for you. Netanyahu is a person who knows that once the war ends, he very likely will go to prison, and so it's in his best interest to keep the war going. And so I think that groups like the Peace Alliance and all of us, and certainly in Veterans for Peace, the national, we're pressing for an immediate ceasefire. We were horrified, as a group, by the Hamas actions on October 7th, and pulled no punches there in condemning the mass violence against the civilians, against the Israeli citizens that took place on October 7th. But what to me gives me a little bit of more hope is that pretty quickly after October 7th, voices within Israel proper began to warn about a possible genocidal military campaign, began to challenge the Israeli cabinet, the leadership. And that I've never seen before, that level of challenge and that level of questioning. I remember President Jimmy Carter and the wonderful book he wrote in 2007, Peace or Apartheid. And so there's a lot of voices trying to get this conflict under some kind of control, but right now we just have to work harder. Let's start with where we are now, the Peace Alliance. That the Peace Alliance uses, from what I understand, a very common sense approach to the idea of peace. First of all, recognizing that you have to have peace isn't just the absence of violence. Peace has to exist in a whole context and universe of equity and social justice, right? I mean, that's the problem right now in the Middle East. That's the problem in Ukraine and Russia. the lack of social justice, the lack of equity, the unequal access to resources fuels these seemingly interminable conflicts. I'm much more hopeful than a lot of my comrades in Veterans for Peace, or some of them. To me, the fact I constantly look at the polls, and the mainstream polls tell us that anywhere from 65 to 73% of Americans, and I checked this yesterday, want an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. They don't want to let Israel finish a job, whatever that means. Israel doesn't even know what that means. They want an immediate ceasefire now, because the majority of Americans, and this is what we've been known for, this is a strength of the culture that we have to hold on to. And regardless of how much they disagreed with each other, everyone from Karl Marx to Alexis de Tocqueville to Charles Dickens to all the people that came to the U.S. or thought about the U.S. in the 19th century had one thing in common. They came away saying, these are people, they're not always well led. In fact, some of their leaders are catastrophes. How many of us now can name any presidents of the United States in the 19th century other than maybe Abraham Lincoln? And then the other ones that come to mind are really second-rate characters at best. But it's the common sense that our nation has as a people, even though we screw up quite a bit. And to me, again, the common sense says peace. Okay, so if a majority, and this was true in Iraq. I remember my brother-in-law went out in his second deployment to Iraq at the time when the majority of the American people said, Basta ya, enough. This is enough. Time to draw down in Iraq. It's over. It's finished, right? Peace to me is not a Republican or Democrat issue. It's not even necessarily a left or right political issue, because frankly, now you find a lot of people on the left who support the war in Gaza. Believe it or not, you find a lot of people on the left who support almost to what looks to me like a forever war between Ukraine and Russia. You find a lot of Republicans who say, bring the troops back now. A lot of Republicans are like, why do we have so many military bases all over the world, right? And that's why I think the Peace Alliance's peace cabinet position is a great start, but you have to be able to institutionalize it. I think that both political parties, peace has got to be that issue that we push. The other issue has got to connect that is poverty. Because right now, according to the latest US Census Bureau statistics I've seen, and I looked through 3 nights ago because I'm giving a talk on the anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign, Dr. King's last campaign. And according to the Census Bureau, you have about 38 million Americans today living in poverty. And that means that poverty should be the #1 political policy issue in this country, and everything else should be like number 10. Okay, because poverty encompasses so many things: domestic abuse, racism, systemic inequality, lack of educational access, lack of access to decent health care, right? And no one's talking about it. So again, that's a dearth within the Democratic and Republican parties. I'm going to tell you right now, if you paid me to be a political advisor and you said, "Hey, how does my party win the 2024 election?" and I would tell you, "Okay, you're not going to get corporate money for saying this, but man, you could get so many people to vote for your political party if you just uplifted poverty as the #1 issue." Wow. But until that happens, I don't see how the Democrats or Republicans can really get back into a modality where they say that they're speaking for the majority of the American people. I'm just very heartened and very inspired and very happy and joyful to learn about the Peace Alliance's work. And again, I'll go back to, I love the idea of the Peace Cabinet. I love the educational work that campaign is involved in, even if it's not going to succeed. Safe to say we're not going to have a peace, we're not going to have that position for a little while, right? But even if we don't, the great kind of educational work to me is just very inspiring. I remember reading the very last day I was in the Army, I was out processing out of the Panama Canal Zone. And it was one of those hurry up and wait moments. You have so much in the military, hurry up and wait. And so I was waiting for this flight to take me back to the United States. And I went over across the street, and there's a very small post library. And I've always loved reading. So I said, I'll find something that's not too thick, and I'll sit down and read for 2 or 3 hours and then hop on the plane, C-130, to Miami or Dallas, wherever I went. And I picked up this very thin volume and I started reading it. I don't remember it having a cover. And it was so astonishing, Nancy, reading this book. And that's the first time I heard the term or read the term nonviolence. And it was a narrator who was talking about how his people had been in bondage and have been oppressed for centuries. And we're now at the point where they're moving against oppression. And the only thing they were upset about was not even their own oppression. They were upset that so many people failed to join this struggle for peace and nonviolence and justice. And the author was saying, especially, I could tell it was to a religious audience. He was saying, if you think you're religious, why are you on the sidelines? And the book blew me away. It was almost as if it was written in English. I could read English, but to me, it was still a foreign language because I didn't know this language of social justice and peace. But that book changed my life. And that book was Letter from a Birmingham Jail by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah.
And I mean, never underestimate the power of stories, because it was the storytelling value of that book to talk about Dr. King and the community of African Americans fighting against injustice that was so compelling to me. I thought, my gosh, I mean, I've always been taught that if you have problems like this, you pick up a gun and you sort them out. As an American, as Americans, that's how we're still raised. But the idea that you could have nonviolent civil disobedience in the face of the worst type of oppression was so thrilling to me and just eye-opening.